Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in this beautiful sunny afternoon. At least it's sunny here in New York. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hannah Sattler. I am the Assistant Director of Synagogue Engagement at the ADL New York, New Jersey office. So I am dealing mostly with our signature synagogue program, which I know a lot of you are involved in. It is ADL's year-long partnership that we're doing with synagogues. So this is part of that program. And I just want to also thank Rabbi Josh Stanton, who's from East End Temple and on the phone right now, and Shelley Winkler, who both had the suggestion of putting this webinar on. So thank you both for making that suggestion and giving me some work to do, because we're all kind of trying to figure out some way to engage our constituents. So thank you so much for bringing this idea to the table. So today we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Sandmel, who is ADL's Director of Interreligious Engagement. He will be presenting on loving the Jews, Philosemitism, and Judaizing in contemporary Christianity. So hopefully this is a little much needed break from the news right now, but still an interesting topic. So Rabbi Sandmel, just to give you some background, he is a longtime interfaith activist. He served as the Director of Interreligious at ADL, Interreligious Engagement at ADL since 2014. From 2003 to 2014, he held the Crown Ryan Chair in Jewish Studies at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. There he led a team, taught a course with an imam and a Catholic theologian on 3 traditions, and co-led interfaith visits to Israel and Palestine. So before I turn it over to Rabbi Sandmel, today's webinar, Rabbi Sandmel will be presenting for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask, feel free to put it in the chat, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can also email your questions to me. My email is hsattler, that's HSATTLER, @adl.org. So I will be moderating the questions just so we don't have people going off and on mute. So feel free to use either of these 2 functions. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Rabbi Sandmel.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. Am I being heard? Yes, I'm being heard. You're not? Okay, good. Excellent. Okay. So first of all, first and foremost, I hope that everybody is staying both safe and sane, and that everyone will come through this okay. I'm sure that we're all worried about our families and our loved ones and our friends, and I just wanted to acknowledge that before I launch into my presentation here. So I'm talking today about Philosemitism, and if we were sitting in a room, I would ask people to raise their hands and say, how many of you have ever heard the term before? We've all heard of anti-Semitism, but I often get puzzled looks when I mention Philosemitism. If you search anti-Semitism on the internet, you'll get over 30 million hits. I'm guessing 20 million of them go to ADL, but there are 30 million hits. If you do the same for Philosemitism, you come up with less than 100,000. Both words, of course, are very difficult to define, since each one encompasses a range of meanings. Nazi anti-Semitism was based on pseudoscientific racial theories, while Christian anti-Semitism, or perhaps better, anti-Judaism, was based on theological issues and differences in belief. And there are, of course, gray areas where they overlap and so forth. Anti-Semitism is also a hard word. We immediately go to the extremes when we hear it. You know, it's possible, and this is what we learned through our polling data, is that a person can hold this biased view against Jews or this stereotype without necessarily being a genocidal maniac. But you know, what happens is when we say the word anti-Semitism, we all automatically go to the extremes. Now, Philosemites may love the Jews because they believe that the Jews are God's chosen people, or because Jesus was Jewish, or as a conscious rejection of anti-Semitism, or out of a sense of guilt, and compensation for past Christian persecution, especially, but not only, the Shoah, the Holocaust. It can be expressed in attitudes or in actions, including the publication of official church documents, and also, and we'll look into this some more, perhaps the misuse and use of Jewish symbols and rituals. And sometimes the line between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism can be hard to determine. There's an old joke that the difference between the anti-Semite and the philo-Semite is that at least the anti-Semite is honest. Now, one of the other problems with the word both anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic is the whole concept of Semitism. Of course, it was designed as a racial, or understood as a racial term, where it's really a linguistic term, and there are all kinds of problems with it. People have talked about, well, maybe we should use anti-Jewish bias or other terms along those lines, but we're kind of stuck with anti-Semitism. Similarly, we're kind of stuck with philo-Semitism. I've heard people talk about, maybe philo-Judaic, or even Judeophilia. That has its own problems. There's the Hebrew term Ohev Yisrael. I'm kind of stuck with the word. And there's a lot of negative reactions to the word as well. I gave a presentation on this last summer at the meeting of the International Council of Christians and Jews. And when I told the head of that organization that I thought the ICCJ was a philo-Semitic organization, she said, no, not us. Because in her mind, it was connected only with evangelicals and Christian Zionism and so forth. So for today, I want to start with the idea that this is a broad term. Unlike anti-Semitism, all anti-Semitism is negative. I would like to suggest that while some aspects of philo-Semitism may be perceived as negative, not all philo-Semitism is, and in fact, some of it is quite positive. So as I go through this, think about this word anti-Semitism and how you initially reacted to it and how you think about it by the time I finish up here. So I want to talk about some of the factors that influence philo-Semitism, and one is what's known as the Christian reclamation of Judaism. Now, here I'm consciously referring or referencing the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. Contemporary scholars, both Jewish and Christian, have shown that during the 19th century and the 20th century, attitudes towards Jesus among Jews in the West moved away from the classical negative view as Jesus as a renegade Jew who brought untold misery to his people. And instead, a new Jesus emerged in the Jewish imagination, a Jew of whom other Jews could be proud, a brother. The Jewish reclamation of Jesus, however, is limited to the fully human Jewish Jesus. It does not encompass Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, the risen Christ, who's the object of Christian faith. In that regard, the Jewish reclamation of Jesus is found wanting by some Jewish scholars. Similarly, the Christian reclamation of Judaism is selective and often filtered through a specifically Christian lens. If for Jews, the reclamation of Jesus requires stripping Jesus of any Christological aspect, the Christian reclamation of Judaism may involve adding in aspects of Christology in one form or another. So when this involves ritual, what may have had its origins in Judaism can be sometimes transformed into a form of Christian piety. And if we think about the Christian reclamation of Jesus, it's kind of stark when comparison to the historical teachings of the church. The church was of God, and the Jews were not of God, and so forth. The performance of Jewish rituals was considered a heresy in early Christianity, especially focusing on things like circumcision and the dietary regulations. The appeal of Judaism for the newly Christian in the early centuries remained a concern for church authorities. And we see this in the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, and so forth. John Gager of Princeton writes, popular Christianity was not nearly as convinced as were its leaders that the beliefs and practice of Judaism had been rendered powerless by the appearance of Christianity. For significant numbers of Christians in late antiquity, Judaism continued to represent a powerful and vigorous religious tradition. Unlike their ecclesiastical and theological superiors, they saw no need to define themselves in opposition to Judaism or to cut themselves off from this obvious source of power. Recent studies have suggested that the boundary between Judaism and Christianity, and therefore between Jews and Christians, remained fluid much longer than was previously acknowledged. There used to be this idea that with the Bar Kokhba revolt, Judaism and Christianity split, or with this event. And in fact, what we see is that the boundary lines remained kind of fuzzy. There were Jewish followers of Jesus. There were Gentile followers of Jesus who adopted certain Jewish customs. And depending on where people were geographically and even socially, upper class, lower class, the division that we think today is very sharp remained quite fluid. And so what we see as a result of that is that in order to respond to that, both the Christian church drew very sharp lines and said anything that smacks of Judaism is out, and emerging rabbinic Judaism also drew a sharp line and said anything that has to do with Christianity is out. That was the history. It's worth knowing that while Jewish-Christian relations and Jewish-Christian dialogue have historically taken place primarily among Jews, mainline Protestants, and Roman Catholics, the location of some of the most enthusiastic reclamation is in the evangelical community. So I'm going to be taking a look at all of these as we go through, and we'll see where we come out on the other end. In terms of the Christian reclamation of Judaism, I just want to share two quotes here. The first quote is from John Paul II, who's seen here on the right-hand side, shaking hands with Rabbi Eliyahu Toaf, who was then chief rabbi of Rome. In his speech at the synagogue in the year 2000, the Pope said, he was listing some things. He says, the first is that the Church of Christ discovers her bond with Judaism by searching into her own mystery. Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion. With Judaism, therefore, we have a relationship which we do not have with any other religion. You are our dearly beloved brothers, and in a certain way, it could be said that you are our elder brothers. And in a similar line, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, pictured here with Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, Chief Rabbi of England, he wrote in a recent document put out by the Anglican Church, as Christians, our understanding of the revelation of God in Christ is impoverished when we fail to appreciate God's calling of and upon the Jewish people. In simple terms, the church is being less than its true self when it refuses the gift of Christian-Jewish encounter. So those are from two very mainstream Christian leaders talking about what I would consider this sort of reclamation of Judaism. In this next slide, we see something very different. This is from the website of the New Life Christian Church, a non-denominational church in San Antonio, Texas, that has about 4,000 members. And here's what it says. It's a little bit long, but I'll see if I can cut it back here. But walk anywhere on our campus and you will sense a strong Jewish influence. From our majestic Sea of Galilee replica, or our beautiful Western Wall replica, or the alternating American and Israeli flags, And go on. He goes on. First and foremost, let me assure you that anything you see at New Life always has a scriptural basis. We believe the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation. In our quest to learn about Jesus, we embrace his roots, heritage, and culture. We study Torah, we embrace Jewish history and customs, we sing Hebrew songs, we travel to Israel, we pray daily for her. I firmly believe that the God of Israel, his word, land, and his people are inseparable. To understand one, we must study and embrace them all. And he goes on in that level. So we see now mainline Protestant, Catholic, and evangelical in this embrace, this reclamation of Jesus. We see this, it takes a lot of forms. We see it in the use of Hebrew terms and forms. You can see here, the Catholic Church put out a major paper in 1998 called We Remember, a Reflection on the Shoah. And the use of that term Shoah by the Catholic Church is a very conscious choice. And it's not used just as a word. They use it with religious, theological overtones. The little songs kids love to sing. Again, you'll see I'm bouncing around here from sort of the Pope to a record here. And it has 25 Bible action songs, including I Am a Christian Soldier, and so forth. And guess what? Hine Matov is on there as well. The words like shalom are used all over in the Christian world. We find tikkun olam being used there. Obviously, Yeshua, supposedly the Hebrew name of Jesus, is being used. And so you'll find more and more in Christian settings Hebrew words and so forth. We also have an interesting phenomenon in Israel, which is the emergence of a community of Hebrew-speaking Christians. These are primarily immigrants from the former Soviet Union and foreign workers from the Philippines and so forth who have moved to Israel, had children. Those children are growing up as Israelis, going to Israeli schools, speaking Hebrew. And now the Catholic Church in the Holy Land has a special vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics. We also see the use of ritual items, and this is primarily, but not entirely, primarily in more conservative evangelical settings. Christian websites and catalogs offer Jewish rituals items for sale. Christianbooks.com, the internet arm of Christian Book Distributors, describes itself as the world's largest distributor of Christian products. And you can buy menorahs, shofarot, mezuzot. You can buy a prayer shawl like the one pictured here that has the Lord's Prayer in it, both in English and in Hebrew. I realize it's a little fuzzy, but if you look on the talit on the left-hand side, it says, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, and so forth. Other Jewish ritual items have been reimagined using Christian texts and concepts, sort of like the mezuzah pictured at the bottom here. Oh, I'm not quite sure how that got in there. That's a mistake. Forgive me. That was a joke, really. There is also the concept of a Christian bar mitzvah. Here is a book called A Parent's Guide to a Christian Bar Mitzvah. The author argues that the parental blessing of children at the time of puberty to release them to adulthood is not a Jewish tradition or primitive ceremony, but an ancient path that has been lost and deserves to be restored. He describes a Jewish friend whose bar mitzvah was the most important day of his life and states, quote, I would like to suggest that believers in Yeshua, the Messiah, we should call our children passing through our ceremony a bar barakah or bat barakah, which in Hebrew is son of the blessing or daughter of the blessing, and he outlines a course of study. And in case you think this is limited only to the, again, to the evangelical world, the Episcopal Church has something called Rite 13. And if you Google that, you'll see that it's found all over the Episcopal world. It is not a Christian bar mitzvah per se, but rather it's an adaptation. It's a program and an educational opportunity, ending up, I think, in sort of a graduation or a ritual targeted at 12 and 13-year-olds. And what they say is, it is very similar to a bar bat mitzvah in the Jewish tradition. It invokes bar mitzvah as a familiar point of departure, a ritual that allows us to celebrate together the transition from childhood to manhood or womanhood. And it goes on, and again, it references bar and bat mitzvah. Now, this is not a Christian bar mitzvah. This is a program and a rite designed by the Episcopal Church. But what I'm suggesting is the conscious borrowing of the Jewish concept suggests a certain reclamation and even a certain appreciation. They probably, if they'd done it 50 years ago or 100 years ago, they wouldn't have referenced Judaism at all. Timely for this time of year, of course, we have the Christian Seder. Now, I make a very stark distinction between a Christian Seder and a model Seder for Christians. A model Seder for Christians is something that's led by Jews, and it's meant to teach Christians about the Jewish festival and Jewish tradition. A Christian Seder is a worship setting which has taken the Passover Haggadah and turned it into a form of Christian worship. So one writer says, our goal here in presenting a Christian adaptation of Passover is to retain the theological, confessional, and educational dimensions of the service. That is, it is presented as a way for people of Christian faith to express that faith in a context of gathered community by participating symbolically in the story of salvation. It is presented very deliberately and purposefully as a Christian service with no apologies. Well, he may believe that there are no apologies going on there, but the Jewish community takes a very dim view of this, especially when we see things like the three matzahs represent the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We remove the middle matzah and break it, just like Jesus was broken. And look at the stripes on the matzah. Those remind us of the whippings that Jesus received at the hands of the Romans. And then we hide the matzah away, the afikomen, and we bring it back at the end of the service, just like Jesus was hidden in the cave and resurrected. So you can imagine how Jews would react to this kind of adaptation or of our ceremony, even if it's done not necessarily to be malicious. And so a couple of years ago, a colleague of mine and I wrote an article which appeared in Christianity Today called Jesus Didn't Eat a Seder Meal and Neither Should You. So, we see different ways that Hebrew Jewish prayers, Jewish ritual items are being used in various different Christian settings. What is driving this? I identify 5 factors. One is the growing recognition of the Jewishness of Jesus. Second is a sense of kinship with Jews, the impact of post-Shoah Jewish-Christian relations, Israel and Christian Zionism, and then the impact of Messianic Judaism. And I'm going to give some examples of each of these. Let me just start with, where's my bumper sticker? It's not on there. There we go. The t-shirt that says, my boss is a Jewish carpenter. I've also seen that as a bumper sticker. You can get it as a mug and so forth. What this represents to me is the fact that the idea that Jesus was Jewish has now become mainstream in the culture. In fact, there was just a study that showed if you ask Americans to name a Jew, 61% of them will name Jesus. Now, this is a huge turnaround because a little more than a century ago, the idea that Jesus was Jewish would have been rejected by most Christians and even by many scholars. Another interesting thing about my boss as a Jewish carpenter is that it presupposes that that message is going to be understood. Everybody knows what people are talking about. And of course, what it means that Jesus was Jewish is that if I want to do what Jesus did, what would Jesus do in the bottom left-hand corner there? Then I want to celebrate like Jesus did. And what did Jesus do? Jesus observed the Sabbath. Jesus kept kosher. Jesus kept the Passover. Jesus wore tzitzit, and so on and so forth. So we find that there are people who are adapting or adopting Jewish rituals, even if they are rituals that didn't exist at the time of Jesus, but this is a way for people, Christians, to feel closer to Jesus. The Passover Seder is a perfect example of this, because the Passover Seder ritual as we have it did not exist at the time of Jesus. It was developed by the rabbis specifically to allow Jews a way to celebrate the Passover without the temple. So that's why we say Jesus never celebrated a Seder. He celebrated Passover, but he didn't know a thing about the Seder. So this Jewishness of Jesus becomes a point of contact. And if Jesus was Jewish and I love Jesus, I should love Jesus's people, the Jews. The Holocaust is another significant factor here. Irving Greenberg has described the Shoah as a revelatory event for Christianity. By this he means that through the Holocaust, Christians came to understand things about God and their own tradition they had not known before. Specifically, its negative attitude towards the Jews, and more broadly, the triumphalism that can emerge from the belief in the universal significance of the Christ event, and that ultimately resulted in the Shoah. And so you have we saw the Catholic Church reflections on the Shoah that they published in 1998. Other Christian denominations have put out similar documents. I also note that, by the way, going back to my Hebrew point, that the Catholic document also talks about the church doing tshuva, doing repentance, again, using the Jewish term. Using the sacred terminology of the other in a document like this is not only an act of contrition, but it's a statement of solidarity and identification. So, we find in the Christian, I certainly find a certain collective Christian shame and guilt for the past Christian persecution of Jews. And so that is one of the other factors driving this sort of philo-Semitism. And of course, we even find that, I went too quickly here. We find various church organizations holding Yom HaShoah celebrations, or not celebrations, but observances. The United Methodist Church has that in its calendar, and so forth. The Catholic Church, in fact, has a prayer in its liturgy for the Sunday closest to Yom HaShoah. They read the following: "For the victims of the Holocaust, their families," and now listen to this language, "and all our Jewish brothers and sisters, that the violence and hatred they experience may never again be repeated, we pray to the Lord. For the church, that the Holocaust may be a reminder to us that we can never be indifferent to the sufferings of others, we pray to the Lord. Again, for our Jewish brothers and sisters, that their confidence in the face of long suffering may spur us on to greater faith and trust in God, we pray to the Lord." And of course, when John Paul II visited Israel in 2000, he left a kvittel, a little note in the Western Wall with these words on it: "God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We're deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer. And asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant." This is Pope Benedict visiting Auschwitz. Excuse me, my papers are sticking together And just to turn now briefly to the evangelical world on this topic, this is Corrie ten Boom. She and her family, they were Dutch, they sheltered Jews during the Shoah and eventually were sent to concentration camps themselves. She has long been honored by evangelical Christians as an exemplar of Christian faith and action. She established a post-war home for camp survivors trying to recover. She went to travel widely as a missionary, preaching God's forgiveness and the need for reconciliation. And when I meet with evangelicals, her name is often invoked. Now let's talk a little bit about the state of Israel. The establishment of the state of Israel, and especially travel to Israel, has provided another avenue for Christians to connect to Jews and Judaism. Christian tourism in Israel accounts for as much as a quarter of Israel's tourist industry, and the Ministry of Tourism actively courts the Christian market, as do private tour operators. Many churches, just like synagogues, offer tours and trips. Though Christian tours may focus primarily on Christian holy sites associated with Jesus in the early church, even limited exposure to Jewish history and Jewish life in Israel can have a profound impact in Christian understandings of and identification with Jews and Judaism, especially when it is part of a religious tour or pilgrimage, not just secular tourism. Christian tourists in Israel often purchase their ritual items that I've mentioned before. You can walk through the Cardo in Jerusalem and find the Christian talit and Christian mezuzot, Christians buying shofarot, and so forth. Now, I want to say a few words about Christian Zionism, which is a subset of what I'm talking about now. For some evangelical Christians, the establishment of the state of Israel is seen in eschatological terms as a prerequisite for the second coming of Jesus. According to Christians United to Israel, led by Pastor John Hagee, who's on the right there, Christian Zionism can be defined as Christian support for the Zionist cause, the return of the Jewish people to its biblical homeland in Israel. It is a belief among some Christians that the return of Jews to Israel is in line with biblical prophecy and necessary for Jesus to return to earth as its king. These Christians are partly motivated by writings of the Bible and the words of the prophet. However, they are also driven to support Israel because they wish to repay the debt of gratitude to the Jewish people for providing Christ and the other fundamentals of their faith, and to support a political ally. Now, for other Christians, you know, this is sort of this sort of eschatological thing, especially the idea that the Jews have to be in Israel in order for Jesus to return, is part of what's known as premillennial dispensationalism. But that only represents about 10% of American evangelicals. There are a lot of other American evangelicals and non-evangelical Christians who support Israel out of a sense of kinship with Jews, out of a sense of respect for Jews, and also having really nothing to do with religion, but because Israel is a democracy, it's America's ally, it was a part of our defense against the Cold War and now against terrorism. So there are lots of reasons to do that. Now, you also find people in the mainline churches who are supportive of Israel, but they're very leery of Christian Zionism. This is a bit of an inner Christian debate that we sometimes find ourselves in the middle of, and that's not always so comfortable. And it's not only among American and English-speaking Christians that we find this Christian Zionism, but increasingly also among Latino evangelicals, both in this country and increasingly in South America. Now, I want to talk, say a brief word here about Christian Zionism. This is the title of a book by a friend of mine, whose name just went out of my head, of course. Gerald McDermott, and he has written several books on Christian Zionism from a personal theological perspective that are not dispensationalists. They're not eschatological. They have other theological support for, he has other theological support for it, and he also is very concerned about the idea of supersessionism that has been so central in Christian anti-Judaism, that that the church has superseded the Jews as God's people. He argues against that, and he puts forth a new Christian Zionism that is neither dispensationalist nor is it supersessionist. So we can see how some of these things are, how varied this phenomenon is. A few words about Messianic Jews. There's a close relationship between Messianic Jews, and this is all in quotation marks, Messianic Jews, and some Christians, especially some Christian Zionists, or some evangelical churches like the Southern Baptists who maintain an active mission to Jews. On the one hand, Messianic Jewish organizations often rely on churches as sources of funding. On the other hand, churches turn to Messianic organizations to provide educational programs, especially to conduct Christian seders. They look at Messianic Jews as true Jews and then learn about Judaism, but they learn about it through a Messianic lens. Since Messianic Jewish worship makes use of Hebrew terminology, Jewish music, Jewish ritual items, it stands to reason that Christians who have come in contact with these organizations and by their ideology, which also stresses the Jewishness of Jesus, have been influenced by them. Another influence is what's known as the Roots movement or the Hebrew Heritage movement. Again, I'm going to read a short passage here. I am paying attention to the time, Hannah. This comes from something known as the Restoration Foundation, a nonprofit research and development educational foundation with a vision of promoting the restoration of the Judaic heritage of the Christian church. And here's what they have to say. Something truly profound is happening. Christians around the world are working to restore the Hebrew foundation of Christian faith in what can only be viewed as a sovereign work of the Holy Spirit. After being marred by 18 centuries of Judeophobia, anti-Judaism, and anti-Semitism, a revolution of restoration is impacting the Christian church. Scholars, clergy, and laity from virtually every nationality, ethnicity, and denomination are reconnecting their faith in Jesus with its historical Jewish roots. Recovering the church's Hebraic heritage is restoring an over-Hellenized, over-Latinized Christianity to the faith of Jesus and the apostles. It is replacing the church's traditional Greco-Roman dualistic mindset with the biblically Hebraic holistic mindset in which the earliest church expressed their faith and devotion to God. Believers' lives are being enriched as they become more truly Christian by being more like their Jewish Lord. Restoration Foundation is publishing materials and so forth. So that gives you a little bit of an idea about this roots or Hebrew heritage movement. So when we take all of this together, and we look at the new relationship between Judaism and Christianity, especially after the Second World War, we see that it has affected more than attitudes. It has led some Christians to adapt aspects of Jewish culture and ritual as expressions of both kinship with Jesus and with Jews. In antiquity, the church fathers taught anti-Judaism and sought to root out Judaizing. Today, many Christians reject anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, embrace Jews as brothers and sisters, and to varying degrees see Jewish practice as a resource that can be used to enhance Christian spirituality and identity. And though we tend to think of it as being limited to the evangelical world, as I have shown, it exists beyond it as well. Some Christians have told me that these Jewish practices seem more authentic to them than their own Christian practices, which they now have come to understand are not rooted in the life and experience of Jesus, but are things that were developed much later by the church. In a way, then, the Christian reclamation of Judaism and Jewish ritual in part serves to bridge a gap that has been opened by contemporary scholarship on Christian origins between the religion of Jesus, what Jesus and his contemporaries would have done, and the religion about Jesus that was developed primarily by Gentile Christians after his crucifixion. The adoption and adaptation of Jewish rituals has already raised concerns within the Jewish community. I've already noted that, and among some Christians. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, for example, warns Christians against participating in Christian seders and says that they ideally go to a Jewish seder, or if not, have a Jewishly knowledgeable person come and lead it. Some Jews see all that I'm talking about here as a positive attitudinal shift among Christians that should be welcomed. Others react negatively to what is perceived to be yet another example of 2,000 years of Christian disregard for the sanctity of the Jewish tradition and Jewish sensibilities. The phenomenon can also be seen in terms of cultural imperialism, or supersessionism. Since Christianity has replaced the Jews as God's covenantal partner, Jewish tradition itself can be mined for Christian purposes without concern about the reaction of Jews. And as I said, other Christians are deeply concerned about this. So there's much about the phenomenon of the Christian reclamation of Judaism and of Philosemitism more broadly that remains to be explored. We don't know exactly how widespread it is, especially outside of Western English-speaking Christian communities. I did note we're getting now some information about Spanish-speaking communities. And there's also a lot of work to be done on what are some of the inner debates about this going on in the Christian church. And then again, how should the Jewish community react? And what are its implications for Jewish-Christian relations? All of these are questions. I might be able to answer some of them in the question period. Or these are things I'm going to be studying for the future. Let me stop here, turn things back over to Hannah, who I think is our MC, and we'll open it up.
Hey, thank you, Rabbi Samuel, for that presentation. A lot of that information I didn't know, so I really appreciate you putting it all together. We do have a few questions, and as a reminder, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you're welcome to email me at hsattler, hsattler, @adl.org. We do have a few questions. So the first one, I mean, you did kind of touch on this, but Rabbi Stanton's asking, what is the line between appreciation and appropriation? And it seems like there's a lot of debate around this, but maybe even just starting with your own personal thoughts on that.
Sure. Great question. I might use the terminology. I might also make a distinction between appropriation and expropriation. I think, certainly in terms of ritual and so forth, I find the use of the talit, the use of the mezuzah, the use of the shofar and so forth, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't like the Christian seders. I love teaching seders. I've done many teaching seders and happy to do it, but I'm uncomfortable by the expropriation of Jewish ritual items or Jewish prayers and turning them into a form of Christian worship. It feels. I use the term, sort of cultural imperialism. That's kind of what it feels like to me. Certainly Jews and Christians share some of, certainly biblical texts and so forth. I'm not as troubled, for example, by the use of Hebrew, since Hebrew was the language of sacred texts for Jesus and his followers. So I think that's legitimate. Um, uh, but I sort of feel like, look, we Jews have our traditions, we have our rituals, we have developed them, we have transmitted them from one generation to another, often under difficult circumstances, under Christian authorities. Now, I think it's legitimate for us to ask just for a little breathing room to be able to do our own thing, and not in a sense, oh, now that you love us so much, now we're going to, do all of these things that you do, and so I don't. That is perhaps not the most articulate expression of it, but that's how I'd answer that question.
Okay, so we had another question about evangelical Philosemites, especially in the US. So how vocal, because I actually hadn't heard of this subsect of evangelical Christianity and this viewpoint. So how vocal are this group in the United States, and where were they during clear anti-Semitic incidents that we've seen over the past few years, especially Charlottesville?
Okay. Well, there are several. The first thing to keep in mind is that the evangelical world is incredibly diffuse and diverse. There is no central office. Many of the churches are independent churches, so many evangelicals don't even belong to a denomination. And it's a really broad catch-all. I have certainly heard expressions of concern about anti-Semitism from some of the evangelical leaders with whom I'm in touch. There's, Christians United for Israel is actually about to, in the near future, is about to put out a feature-length film on anti-Semitism. Makes me a little nervous, frankly, because I'm not quite sure what's going to be in it. So it is a topic here. I'm not sure that oh, how loud is their voice, right? So I think it's broadly fair to say that evangelical Christians are supportive of Israel. Not all for the same reasons. They're not all John Hagee dispensationalists. Some of them fall into the other categories that I talked about, but they're all broadly supportive of Israel. And this is a very important constituency among the more conservative political world, certainly in the Republican Party, and certainly in the base of the current president. So, and if we go back, by the way, let me see if I can find this real quickly. This one. This slide here, showing pastors Robert Jeffries and John Hagee, was taken at the ceremony opening the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. They were both invited jointly by the U.S. and Israel. Clearly, they're seen by both parties as being an important demographic. So you can see why. You can see that they do exert a fair amount of power.
Okay, and then going off of that, what about this myth, or well, the person's asking, is this a myth or is this a partial fact? The idea that there are Christian fundamentalists that are Zionist in the sense that they want to gather all Jews in Israel for their demise. So that would obviously be the other side.
Well, so among premillennial dispensationalists, there is, first of all, the belief that the Jews need to return to the Holy Land as a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. And you, by the way, you find this even as early as some 16th century German pietists. There's this theme of restorationism that actually ended up being very important in Great Britain and led to the Balfour Declaration. So there's an aspect of this Christian Zionism that was very important in the founding of the State of Israel, even though it's a little bit sort of below the surface. Now, what happens in eschatological dramas depends a great deal on who you're reading. Yes, there are some Christian, some evangelical premillennial dispensationalists whose view is that after the Jews are all returned to the land of Israel and Jesus returns, there's going to be a great judgment. And in some of those scenarios, 144,000 Jews will become Christians and the rest will be annihilated. Not a very friendly theology from my perspective. But that is that represents a minority, a small minority among evangelicals. It's there, but again, it's not broadly representative.
Okay, and taking more of an international lens, and I'm not sure how much research you've done on this side of it, but is there an urge to embrace Judaism in Latin America? Is there something about the culture or Jewish communities that at one time fled to the New World?
Very interesting question. So yes, you do see a rise in interest in Judaism among Christians, especially in Latin America. Both Christians United for Israel and an organization called the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews are very active in Latin America with programs in radio programs, television programs, and so forth in Spanish. You see it in there's some in there's a little bit of this in Great Britain. One of the things in Latin America and also in the United States, and especially in parts of the Southwest, is that people are either discovering, some legitimately, some I wonder about, but that they have Jewish roots, that they come from converso families. And some of those people are also now exploring their Jewish roots, introducing aspects of Jewish culture into their lives and into their faith practice. Some are actually becoming Jewish, but those who are not, again, there's a whole range of ways that they approach this. But yes, that aspect, in fact, there's a whole now, I think, academic society studying what is known as crypto-Judaism, because that is Jews who had been hidden. Again, I hope that answers the question reasonably well.
And I think we have time for one more question. So there are a few, I'm just going to try to summarize. There are a few questions about the other side of this. So adopting Jesus into the Jewish faith. So from your knowledge, how prevalent is the Jews for Jesus organization? And secondly, if, using the understanding that Jewish theology believes Jesus was an enlightened teacher, but not the Messiah, why aren't some of Jesus's enlightened teaching discussed in synagogue sermons?
Okay. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head for Jews for Jesus, and there are a number of different. There's Jews for Jesus, there's Messianic Judaism, there's Hebrew Christianity. None of these groups has very large numbers, and even among those who affiliate with these groups, only a percentage of them actually come from Jewish homes. Um, uh, I think their influence is larger than their numbers, in part because they really push the Jewish community's buttons in the first place. And secondly, again, because of the influence that they have on some of the evangelical communities that I mentioned before, that they become the source for Judaism, they become the teachers, and so forth. In terms of Jesus in Jewish life, the question talked about Jesus as an enlightened teacher. The thing is, and this is another webinar I could do sometime called Jewish Views of Jesus. They have been all over the map. Again, Jesus was a renegade Jew who caused untold harm to his people, or Jesus is the great moralizer of Jewish history, or and so forth. Whoever Jesus may have been, his sayings and his teachings are really, were definitely not part of the Jewish tradition. This is a little bit unfair, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's very little that Jesus said that in terms of sort of morality, in terms of the kind of things that a rabbi might choose to cite in a sermon, that are not found elsewhere in Jewish tradition. And the things that Jesus said that are unique are really unique to Christianity and would be inappropriate in a Jewish setting. Again, that's a short answer to a much more complicated question. But my clock says 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful here. So let me pause here and turn it back over to Hannah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Rabbi Samuel, for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm sure if we were all in the same room, we'd be giving you a standing ovation, but we'll do that from our respective homes here. I do just want to remind everybody that ADL is hosting a Fighting Hate from Home weekly webinar series. So if you are interested in joining this week's theme, is around social inclusion in online gaming. So our Center on Technology and Society will be presenting on that. And those webinars are hosted every Thursday at 2:30. And then during Passover, so next week and the week after, it will be on Tuesdays. So I'll follow up with everybody and send that link around in case you're interested. But again, thank you all for joining, and a big thank you to Rabbi Samuel for taking the time today.
Well, thank you, and I hope everybody stays well and has a good Passover.
Thank you.